lost its legitimacy, and it's lost its legitimacy not merely in the peripheral countries of the global south, but it has also lost its legitimacy at the core, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis, which actually demonstrated that how deep inside this was a system which was inherently, fundamentally flawed, and leading up to a crisis which could have generated for us one more Great Depression. Now, this actually would suggest that this moment, as compared to the Bandung moment, would be one in which you would have a greater degree of strength and possibility of solidarity in the effort to take down imperialism in what seems to be a weak moment for imperialism. But we don't seem to find the same degree of solidarity. In fact, it is true that lots of institutions and individuals and organizations have marked 70 years of Bandung, but the celebrations have been sporadic, don't reflect the kind of joy and aspiration which was visible at the time of the Bandung moment. So what exactly happened? Obviously, we did not have a linear movement from the Bandung moment to the current conjuncture, and it's that transformation somewhere in between which generated a situation where, independent of the fact that we happen to be in a world when in some sense the third world can assert itself, particularly because of the fact that despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have at least two countries, which is China and Vietnam, having of course chosen at one point of time to go more market friendly and target international markets, still have used the resilience which came out of the success of their national liberation struggles in order to generate what would be more egalitarian societies, to be successful even within what seems to be a sort of a market economy oriented development strategy targeted at world markets. So in some sense it appears that there is a challenge, there is a new kind of plurality as opposed to the plurality which existed because of the fact that the Soviet Union was there at the time of Bandung, and it was a Soviet Union which of course was, even though it suffered so much in terms of losses during the Second World War, it was known, except for those who wanted to sort of conceal it, that this was a war, the war against fascism was actually won on the Russian front, on the Eastern front. So it was a strong Soviet Union, not merely because of the fact that it put all its people to work, but also because of the fact that it was crucial in the war, in the defeat of fascism, which was a consequence of inter-imperialist rivalry, which socialism itself was not really responsible for. Now, what really happened in terms of this linear moment? And I think what I'd like to suggest is that, in some sense, if you look at Bandung, at the core of Bandung was the idea that what matters most is the nation state and the governments which were representative of the people who constituted those nation states, which is why so much of emphasis on territorial integrity, on the right to self-determination, etc. So if we say that these governments of these nation states had before them at that point of time an agenda to convert political freedom into real economic freedom, what was that strategy? Of course, there were many versions of it, but at the core of that strategy was, to a certain extent, as far as possible, to de-link yourself from international markets through protectionism involving tariffs and quantitative restrictions, to controls on foreign capital inflows into these countries, an unwillingness to accept financial flows, and of course, in most countries also an effort to try and put the state at the center of a development strategy which will allow economic diversification of a kind which would reduce your dependence on international capital and technology, and therefore give you the economic freedom and independence which would consolidate and make meaningful the political independence that you have. Now we know that by the time we got to the middle of the 1970s, despite remarkably good rates of growth in many of these countries relative to what they recorded during the colonial period, and many of them in fact saw either stagnation or even retrogression, that by the time we got to the 80s, somehow the promise which many of these countries displayed in terms of the willingness of these governments to take up these independent strategies didn't get realized. And I think at the core of that was the inevitability of these states having put at the center the state of the government and the nation state to be able to ensure that they would be able to generate for themselves, either individually or through solidarity and cooperation, the markets needed for them to be able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And why was that? That was because of the fact that if you want to grow your market, in the final analysis, you must be willing to attack asset inequality, you must be in a position to deal with land monopoly, break land monopoly through radical land reform. And almost every one of these governments which attended, or leaders which attended Bandung, had this in their programs, that we need to do these things. We need land reforms. It was a period in which there was a huge literature on the implementation of land reforms and the challenges to that. But what we did have is that, other than in a couple of countries, two of which I just mentioned, which is China and Vietnam, there are not very many countries in which we actually saw the implementation of this agenda of dealing with asset inequality and income inequality which comes with that. Because if you don't deal with that, you cannot create the mass markets to be able to generate the growth needed to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Now, if we say that that is the reason, in part, we had a failure, that we were not able to do this, maybe there was something to a view, and I think I'll then wrap up after that. There's something to a view which is expressed, though because of Stalin being involved and so on, very often we don't go back to these things. But at the 6th Congress of the Communist International, there was an idea. The idea was that, listen, unless national liberation struggles are led by the workers and the peasants, by the working people of countries, whose interests the governments which come to power will serve, you're actually not going to have a successful transition even within the framework of capitalism. And the reason given for that was that if you actually had other elements, say the capitalist class, you would end up in a situation where they would compromise with the landed interests, with feudalism, because of the fact that ever since actually the Paris Commune, but definitely since the October Revolution, there was a fear among the elites and the asset owners of these countries. There was a fear that any effort to undermine land monopoly could translate itself into a movement against private property itself. And therefore, while you had this notion that you wanted to have this program which dealt with asset inequality, in practice it rarely got implemented. And therefore, you ended up with a situation where this effort to grow your own domestic market and win yourself the independence from an extremely unequal international order didn't really get realized. So therefore, if we are really looking at what do we want at this conjuncture? What do we want at a point of time when it's not a Bandung kind of moment, but on the other hand, it's a moment with much opportunity because of the fact, as I said, that on the one hand, there is this weakness, this loss of legitimacy, not merely of the core, but also of capitalism and neoliberalism itself. But on the other hand, we don't see the kind of push, except in a few countries, and sometimes they don't last for long. We don't see the push. What are we looking for? And I think it's important to go back to Bandung and I think get back a core idea that it had, which is that if you want a bulwark against imperialism, it just cannot be only the people. It has to be a state which represents the interests of the people who want to stand against imperialism. I think this is crucial. And therefore, when we are actually trying as democratic forces, as progressive intellectuals, as civil society actors, as we try and ask ourselves what should we do in order to be able to revive that Bandung spirit, which in some sense is flagging, then I think what is most important in all of these countries is for these actors to be able to institute states which reflect the will and the desires and the aspirations of the people and can constitute the actual bulwarks against imperialism. And that's what I hope all of us stand for today. Thank you.